When Everyone Became a Hero by Barbara Pfeiffer. Terrorist Attacks. September 11, 2001 began as a clear autumn morning in the northeastern United States. People were still arriving at work when an airplane crashed into one of the World Trade Center's twin towers in New York City. For a few minutes, everyone thought it was a horrible accident. Then, another plane crashed into the second tower. 37 minutes after that, a third airliner crashed into the Pentagon in Arlington, Virginia, near Washington, D.C. 19 terrorists, people who use violence and fear to try to achieve their goals, had overpowered the crews of 4 airplanes that morning. To take control of a vehicle by use of force is to hijack it. The terrorists flew 3 planes into the buildings on purpose because they were angry at the United States and its influence on the world. Passengers on the 4th plane, Flight 93, fought back against the terrorists. Their plane crashed in a field in Pennsylvania. Many people became heroes that day. In this book, each person whose story is told stands for many others who did the same thing. Twin Towers and More. 7 buildings around an open space called a plaza made up the World Trade Center. They stood in New York City on Manhattan Island. Businesses rented space in 6 of these buildings for their offices, and some large companies used more than one floor. About 50,000 people worked in the offices. The 7th building was a hotel. When the attacks happened, at least 40,000 people were working in the buildings. The 2 most famous buildings were known by several names: the Twin Towers, North Tower and South Tower, or WTC-1 and WTC-2. They were 110 stories high, ranked among the world's 6 tallest buildings. Each tower had 97 elevators for people and 6 elevators for freight. The North Tower was completed in 1970, and its twin opened 2 years later. A building named for its shape. Pentagon is the word that names a 5-sided figure. The United States Department of Defense has its home in a building of that shape, which is simply called the Pentagon. It opened in 1943 and is just across the Potomac River from Washington, D.C. The Pentagon is 5 stories tall and covers 29 acres. The total length of its halls is 17.5 miles. This is the headquarters, or main office, of all the branches of the United States military. About 26,000 soldiers and civilians work there. 4 airliners. Around 8 o'clock on the morning of September 11, 2001, 4 airplanes took off with terrorists on board who were pretending to be regular passengers. Terrorists hijacked Flight 11 from Boston, Massachusetts, and crashed it into the World Trade Center's North Tower about an hour later. Another group of terrorists hijacked Flight 175, which also took off from Boston, and crashed the plane into the South Tower. A third plane, Flight 77, left Washington, D.C., and flew as far as Kentucky before terrorists hijacked it. The terrorists turned the plane back toward Washington, D.C., and crashed it into one side of the Pentagon. A 4th plane, Flight 93, flew from Newark, New Jersey, as far as Ohio. A few people on board heard about the first 3 crashes on their cell phones. When terrorists captured their plane, some of the passengers decided to fight back. The terrorists crashed the plane in a field in northeastern Pennsylvania. Many people think their real target was the White House or the United States Capitol. Office workers help each other. After the attacks on the World Trade Center took place, cement dust and burning jet fuel filled the buildings with thick black smoke. It was difficult to see and breathe. Many office workers helped each other to escape the buildings. Here are just 2 stories. Michael Benfante and John Sequeira worked on the 81st floor of the North Tower. They felt the building sway from the crash before seeing fire outside the windows. They began walking down the stairs because they knew it was not safe to use elevators during fires. On the 68th floor, they met a woman in a wheelchair. Using a special rescue chair they found, the 2 men carried her down the stairs. It took them an hour to reach safety. In the South Tower, stock trader Wells Crother, a volunteer firefighter in his spare time, used his special training and carried some people down the stairs. He got dazed people to help others hurt by the crash. Crother stayed in the building to help New York City firefighters. Firefighters, EMTs, and police. As office workers went down the stairs in the Twin Towers, firefighters and emergency medical technicians, or EMTs, rushed up the stairs. Each New York Fire Department member carried 60 pounds of tools along with an oxygen tank. Outside, other firefighters gathered. They could not reach the fires high in the towers, but they fought smaller fires on the ground. EMTs treated injured people who stumbled outdoors. The 2 airplanes each had been holding about 24,000 gallons of jet fuel. The fires from the crashes burned as hot as 460 degrees and weakened the tower's steel frames. The towers had remained standing after the crashes, the North Tower for about 100 minutes and the South Tower for nearly 60 minutes. Thousands of people escaped during that time. Finally, the tower's steel frames collapsed and the buildings fell straight down. Inside, 343 firefighters and 23 police officers were killed. Later that day, WTC, or Building 7, and the hotel also collapsed. Pentagon rescuers. The Pentagon has its own police and fire departments, but other fire departments from Virginia and the District of Columbia came to help. Many soldiers working inside the Pentagon quickly created teams to dig tunnels under furniture and fallen walls to allow people to crawl out. One large man from the Navy held up a ceiling while people escaped. No one found out his name. Army Lieutenant Colonel Victor Correa walked through smoke in a darkened hallway shouting. Over and over he yelled, "Listen to me. Follow my voice." It worked, and he led people outdoors. Staff Sergeant Christopher Brayman, a Marine Corps cook, used his search and rescue training when he heard a woman clapping loudly. She could not breathe well enough to call for help and was badly burned. Brayman found her and carried her outside, then went back inside to find others. Land the airplanes. The Federal Aviation Administration, or FAA, sets the rules for all types of non-military airplanes. After the first 2 crashes on September 11th, the FAA stopped planes from taking off and told air traffic controllers to have all other planes land wherever they could. Air traffic controllers talk to pilots by radio. They have to stay calm in emergencies, such as storms, or at times that pilots need extra help. Now, they had to start landing nearly 4,000 planes. Only military planes were allowed to fly, including Air Force One, the president's plane. President George W. Bush had been visiting a school in Florida when the attacks took place. No one knew if terrorists had hijacked more airplanes, or whether terrorists were riding on other planes that they planned to hijack. If a plane refused to land, it would be checked further. All airliners had landed safely around noon, thanks to dozens of controllers. Only military planes could fly for the next 2 days. Airports made stranded passengers as comfortable as possible. Local businesses help. When the Twin Towers collapsed in New York City, they filled the air for many blocks with choking smoke and dust. At that time, thousands of people were walking and running to safety. Restaurants, stores, and hotels opened their doors. Managers let people come inside, have a drink of water, and use the restrooms. Those things are usually for customers only, but September 11th was different. Subways and trains stopped running because no one knew if they were safe. People had to walk for miles to get home. Some stores passed out free running shoes to people who had lost their shoes while rushing down the stairways or sidewalks. A fancy hotel set up beds and cots in its ballroom. The chef started cooking huge batches of food instead of single dinners. Rescue workers were welcome to eat and rest at the hotel. When darkness fell, some people had to sleep on the streets. Full hotels lent people pillows, sheets, and blankets for the cool night. Searching for survivors. People were still walking or riding buses and ferries, boats that transport passengers or vehicles across a body of water, to their homes in New York. Rescue workers already were digging for survivors at the Twin Towers. In New York and at the Pentagon, off-duty police and firefighters arrived from everywhere. So did doctors, nurses, and EMTs. Construction workers brought heavy machines to move the broken stone and metal pieces of the towers. The first rescue workers to arrive were local, but more rescuers came from far away. Trained search and rescue dogs came with their owners, about 350 teams in all. The dogs crawled into small spaces, walked on broken glass, sniffed for survivors, and heard sounds that humans could not. Spotlights were set up, and rescuers worked all night. They found a few survivors. Whenever a survivor was found, rescuers called for silence. All noise stopped until they found the trapped person. People donate. Within 4 days, more than 250,000 people donated blood for survivors. Usually, in 4 days, only about 91,000 people do that. People who are badly burned or lose blood in accidents need new blood to replace the lost blood and to help them heal. In New York City, Robin Marandino, her sisters, their mother, and a friend went to 40 restaurants and supermarkets. They asked for free hot food for the rescue crews. They soon had 1,500 pounds of meals. They needed 5 vans to deliver the food. The nation gives. Companies around the United States began donating toys, clothing, blankets, snacks, and other items to people in New York City and Arlington, Virginia. These items were for survivors, families of those who died, and rescue workers. The New York Fire Department lost 91 fire trucks, rescue trucks, and cars when the Twin Towers collapsed. Residents of Louisiana, Ohio, and Utah bought new fire trucks for the department. School children in Columbia, South Carolina, held a fundraising drive that raised money to buy New York City a new fire truck. At least 2 trucks were gifts from companies that build fire trucks. Schools, clubs, and businesses across the United States held events to raise money. They sent checks to bank accounts that had been created for those harmed by the attacks. Some accounts were for educating children who lost relatives. Other accounts helped people who had to move out of their damaged apartments. Still other accounts were for survivors who needed long-term medical care. Worldwide sympathy and changes. Other nations around the world expressed their sympathy for the United States losses. Today we are all Americans, said Benjamin Netanyahu, a former Prime Minister of Israel. He meant that all nations shared in the sadness. Working day and night, people cleaned up the World Trade Center site and trucked away the broken steel and cement. They completed the job on May 30th, 2002, 3 months earlier than expected. A contest was held to select a design for new buildings to replace the ones that had been destroyed. Airports made many changes in how they checked passengers getting onto airliners. They wanted to make it impossible for terrorists to take over airplanes ever again. Rebuilding and a memorial. More than 3,000 people died in the 4 attacks on September 11, 2001. They included airplane crews and passengers, office workers in the 3 buildings, firefighters, EMTs, and police. More than 2,500 people survived with injuries. Other people were not hurt. Together, these people were from many states and the District of Columbia in the United States. Others from countries around the world were also among these people. New buildings will be built where the Twin Towers once stood in New York, and a memorial will stand beside them. A memorial is a way to remember and honor a person or a certain event. The damaged part of the Pentagon was repaired and reopened in 11 months. The National Park Service plans to build a memorial where Flight 93 crashed in Pennsylvania. Everyone who helped during and after the attacks, with work and gifts of blood, money, food, or clothing, is a hero of 9/11.